In June 2005, the Taliban brutally killed a Navy SEAL. The U.S. military command immediately issued an order to hunt down the Taliban leader Ahmed at all costs. 16 SEALs quickly boarded 2 Chinook helicopters and, without Apache gunship cover, forced their way deep into Taliban territory. Just as they reached the target area and prepared to fast rope down, an RPG suddenly struck. The Chinook transport helicopter was hit directly, instantly lost control, and crashed into the valley trailing thick black smoke, killing all 16 SEALs on board. Seeing this, the other Chinook transport helicopter hurriedly withdrew from the area. This became the most humiliating day in the history of the Navy SEALs during the war in Afghanistan. But originally, this was supposed to be a simple infiltration and reconnaissance mission. So why did it end like this? At that time, Afghanistan's parliamentary elections were approaching. To ensure the meeting proceeded smoothly, the U.S. Marine Corps joined forces with special operations units to conduct a thorough sweep of the region. It was during this moment that Ahmed, a Taliban extremist leader, took advantage of the situation and became a thorn in the side that the United States was desperate to remove. This Ahmed was brutal by nature and showed no mercy even toward his own people. Anyone who refused to submit to his rule would be killed by his men in front of everyone, and the villagers hated him deeply. On this day, U.S. forces stationed in Afghanistan received reliable intelligence that Ahmed's hideout had been discovered in a mountainous area of Kunar province. As a result, they immediately launched a military operation codenamed Red Wings to prevent large-scale conflict and casualties. The entire operation was divided into 2 phases. In the first phase, a 4-man reconnaissance team led by Navy SEAL Captain Michael Murphy was sent in ahead of time. After obtaining a clear frontal photo of Ahmed and confirming his exact location, headquarters would then deploy another unit to carry out the targeted strike. The 4-man reconnaissance team boarded a Chinook transport helicopter and, under the escort of Apache gunships, quickly reached the outer perimeter of the target area. Using fast ropes, the 4 men descended rapidly to the ground and then proceeded on foot toward the objective. After an overnight armed movement through rugged terrain, the team successfully reached the observation point. Team leader Michael immediately conducted surveillance with binoculars, quickly spotted Ahmed in the crowd, and successfully captured a clear frontal photograph of the target. Danny, who was responsible for communications, immediately took out the radio to contact command, only to discover that the signal was extremely poor and headquarters could not be reached at all. The team dared not act rashly and could only retreat into the bushes below to hide. While adjusting their equipment and searching for a signal to contact command, they also sketched out the defensive layout of the Taliban base. But at that moment, Danny, who was on security watch, suddenly noticed in horror that a group of goats was approaching from not far away, followed by several shepherds. With the mission at a critical stage, they had no choice but to remain concealed, holding their breath in fear of being discovered. However, the unexpected still happened. One of the shepherds stepped squarely onto Marcus's ankle. Left with no alternative, the SEAL team rushed out of the bushes and quickly restrained the 3 men from behind. Captain Michael found a walkie-talkie on the older shepherd. This also meant that they were very likely Taliban lookouts. However, the 3 men carried no weapons, so the team could not take action against them. With the radio showing no signal for a long time and no clear guidance, the team leader had no choice but to risk using an unencrypted satellite phone to request instructions from his superiors. Fortunately, he managed to contact headquarters, but the call quality was extremely poor. By the time his subordinate brought the commander to the phone, the signal dropped again. With no other option, the captain was forced to handle the shepherds on his own. This was a difficult dilemma, and only 3 choices lay before them. The first option was to release the 3 shepherds, but they could be betrayed and quickly hunted down by the Taliban. The second option was to eliminate the 3 shepherds directly, but this would violate U.S. military rules of engagement. If civilians were mistakenly killed and the truth was exposed, they would inevitably face prison sentences. The third option was to tie the 3 shepherds to a tree, leaving them to be eaten by wolves, or die from freezing or starvation. The 4-man team fell into a heated argument because of this. In the end, Captain Michael decided to release the shepherds, abort the mission, and withdraw toward the mountain peak. Once they regained a signal, they planned to contact headquarters and request extraction. What they did not realize was that mercy toward the enemy is cruelty toward oneself. It was precisely this wrong decision that caused the team to pay a devastating price in the actions that followed. As they were moving toward the mountain peak, one of the shepherds quickly descended the mountain and went to a Taliban-controlled village to report what had happened. The 4-man team soon climbed to the mountaintop. but the radio still showed no signal, and the captain's satellite phone also had no reception. It turned out this was only a false summit, and the real peak was still higher. Because the mountaintop was bare and easy to expose their position, the captain immediately decided to pull back into the forest to hide and wait until nightfall to move out on foot. However, not long after the team retreated into the forest, movement was heard around them, and everyone immediately went on alert. The captain cautiously stepped out of the trees to scout ahead, only to discover in terror that the opposite mountaintop was filled with heavily armed Taliban fighters. At the same time, their figures appeared in the scopes of the three men still in the forest, making it clear that they were completely surrounded. Seeing that their position was exposed, the captain immediately ordered everyone to prepare for combat. Soon, Marcus spotted an enemy behind a tree through his magnified optic and decisively pulled the trigger. The gunfire quickly drew in more Taliban fighters. The team immediately began withdrawing using the center peel maneuver. This is an escape technique that evolved from alternating covered retreats. It is specifically designed for small units to break contact quickly when facing large-scale enemy assaults.
Marcus, muoviti!
The four men coordinated closely, constantly changing positions as they fired and retreated in turns, killing more than a dozen Taliban fighters in succession, but the enemy numbers were overwhelming, coming wave after wave like zombies, impossible to completely stop. Danny, who was responsible for communications, quickly pulled out the radio and repeatedly called headquarters, requesting quick reaction force support, but he was never able to get through, and was unfortunately hit in the finger by Taliban fire. Marcus, who was exposed at the front, was also shot in the left shoulder and temporarily lost his ability to fight. Immediately after, an enemy seized the opportunity and rushed forward, engaging Marcus in close combat. Marcus kicked him away, then grabbed his head and smashed it with full force, successfully killing the attacker. At this moment, the Taliban set up a PKM general-purpose machine gun and unleashed heavy fire at a rate of 600 rounds per minute toward the SEAL team. Faced with such fierce firepower, the team was pinned down and unable to raise their heads. If they could not break through immediately, they would all be finished here. Seeing this, Marcus quickly threw a smoke grenade, blocking the enemy's vision, and the team began retreating south. During the withdrawal, Matt was unfortunately shot through the left leg, and before Matt could find cover, Marcus, who was following behind, was also hit in the hip. Just as the SEAL team was about to break out of the encirclement, the Taliban pulled out an RPG and fired a shot without hesitation. The SEAL team was battered and overwhelmed. The radio they had been relying on was also destroyed by enemy fire, making contact with headquarters impossible, so they could only destroy it and continue retreating. But unfamiliar with the terrain, the four men ran straight into a dead end. With no other choice under such intense firepower, the team was forced to risk jumping off a cliff. The four men tumbled and crashed all the way down. Though battered and shaken, they were fortunate to survive. Before they could recover, the Taliban fighters had already caught up and launched another round of heavy fire. As the enemy closed in, the four men could only drag their wounded bodies and continue fleeing desperately downhill. During the escape, Danny was hit in the leg again and completely lost the ability to move. Seeing this, Marcus rushed forward and used a single-man drag technique to pull him along and keep moving. They finally escaped to a pile of rocks, gaining a brief moment to catch their breath. At this point, the SEAL team was running critically low on ammunition, and the satellite phones still had no signal. With everyone wounded, organizing another effective counterattack was no longer possible. Because they had lost their packs during the escape and had no medical kits, they could only use dirt to temporarily plug the bullet wounds. Before long, the Taliban closed in again. Matt quickly threw a smoke grenade, and once the smoke spread, he and the team leader jumped off the cliff first. Marcus hoisted the severely wounded Danny and was just about to jump with him when a sudden bullet struck Danny, causing Marcus to lose his footing and fall heavily down the cliff. Danny, left behind above, was barely clinging to life. The Taliban who caught up did not execute him on the spot, but instead took all the equipment from his body. They then pulled out recording equipment to document what they saw as a triumphant kill. The 3 team members below suffered multiple fractures across their bodies and had nearly lost all mobility, but the Taliban showed no intention of letting them go and continued launching fierce attacks. The 3 men could only force themselves to move while searching for cover. Facing enemy fire from higher ground, the remaining 3 SEALs had no route of retreat left. The team leader took out the satellite phone and looked toward the only nearby high point that might receive a signal, which was the team's only chance to survive. But that position was completely exposed to enemy fire and was very likely a one-way trip. He handed his last 2 magazines to Marcus beside him and then charged toward the high ground without hesitation, with coordinated cover from his 2 teammates. The captain pushed through relentless gunfire and finally climbed to the highest point of the rocks. He took out the satellite phone and successfully made contact with headquarters.
Serve supporto aereo, immediato. Serve aiuto. Stiamo scenderendo nella gola verso Chicago. Ricevuto, Murphy.
With his final strength, the captain completed his mission. Even in the face of death, he refused to collapse, bracing himself with his weapon and forcing himself back to his feet. In the end, he was killed in action. After receiving the distress call, headquarters immediately dispatched a quick reaction force to conduct a rescue. Soon, SEAL Team 10 from Bagram Air Base assembled. They boarded 2 Chinook helicopters and headed out to provide support. At the same time, the closer Jalalabad base also dispatched 2 Black Hawk helicopters, but they were called off just as they were about to take off. This was because the escorting Apaches were on another mission and still on their way back. Without Apache escort, the Black Hawks were not permitted to enter the battlefield. Meanwhile, Taliban attacks continued. The remaining 2 SEALs were completely exhausted and at their limit. To draw enemy fire away, Marcus suggested they split up and each look for a more favorable position, but the enemy was not foolish, and followed the blood trail relentlessly, quickly forcing the 2 men into a dead end, just as they calmly prepared to face death. U.S. reinforcements finally arrived. Watching the 2 Chinooks fly overhead, both men broke down in tears of relief. They screamed with all their strength, releasing all the anger and helplessness they had endured during this time. But as soon as the Chinook helicopters reached the area near the objective, headquarters ordered them to return immediately and abort the rescue mission. The reason was that without Apache escort, the risk was too great. But the captain leading the rescue was too desperate to save lives to care anymore, and despite his subordinates' objections, he insisted on landing anyway. However, the accident still happened. An RPG struck the helicopter, and the Chinook instantly lost control and crashed, killing all 16 SEALs on board. The other Chinook was also hit by intense Taliban fire. Seeing the situation turn hopeless and unable to land, U.S. forces had no choice but to retreat in disarray. As their only remaining hope was shattered, the 2 men fell back into despair. Matt suddenly ran straight into Taliban fighters, quickly drew his Beretta 92 pistol, and shot one of them dead, but he was immediately hit by enemy fire from another direction, and the gunshots quickly drew in more attackers. By this point, Matt was completely out of ammunition. He collapsed to the ground with his back against a tree, calmly accepting death. At this moment, the 4-man SEAL team was reduced to only Marcus. In a patch of grass not far away, a Taliban fighter carrying a rocket launcher had already spotted him. With a loud explosion, Marcus was blasted down the hillside. The intense pain nearly knocked him unconscious, but his instinct to survive drove him to desperately move toward the rocks below. Because the enemy was already closing in, 1 second slower could have cost him his life. At this critical moment, U.S. Apache helicopters finally arrived. Seeing the armed helicopters arrive, Taliban leader Ahmed chose not to confront them head-on and instead led his men to withdraw. Marcus narrowly escaped death as a result. He thought the danger was finally over, but what he did not know was that this Apache had rushed straight from the front line. With no time to refuel, its fuel levels were already critically low. After circling the crash site and finding no survivors, they had no choice but to return to base and reassess the situation. After briefly treating his wounds, Marcus dragged his exhausted body and immediately set out on the run once again. After wandering through the mountains for an unknown length of time, he came upon a water pool, and overcome by thirst, he plunged in, then stood up and began gulping down water. At that moment, a group of Afghan villagers suddenly appeared behind him. Marcus thought they were enemies and quickly pulled out a grenade, threatening to die together with them. However, the villagers showed no hostility and instead reached out to help him, and only then did Marcus lower his guard. Marcus was then taken back to the village. Because they could not communicate due to the language barrier, Marcus handwrote a distress letter and took out the map he carried, asking the villagers to help deliver the message to a US military base. After understanding his request, the villagers immediately set off with the letter toward the base. After a full day of difficult travel, they successfully delivered the distress letter to the US base. Once it was confirmed that the message came from Marcus, the commander immediately ordered that Marcus be rescued at all costs. Soon, Black Hawk helicopters and 2 Apache gunships urgently lifted off from the base and headed toward the village to carry out the rescue. They were determined to wipe away the humiliation and avenge the fallen SEALs. At the same time, the Taliban fighters did not give up. Following the blood trails on the ground and the broken branches, they tracked their way to the village and quickly captured Marcus. Just as they were preparing to execute him, 2 Apache gunships finally arrived at the critical moment. Faced with the devastating firepower of US forces, the Taliban fighters were quickly eliminated. Immediately afterward, Navy SEALs rapidly deployed to the ground and successfully rescued Marcus. The film Lone Survivor is adapted from the true story of the only survivor of the US Navy SEALs Operation Red Wings during the war in Afghanistan. It does not deliberately glorify individual heroism, nor does it beautify itself or demonize others, and the combat scenes are intense and realistic. The sound effects of the various weapons are also highly authentic, making it a very solid war film. Alright, I am a movie enthusiast, and that concludes this episode. See you next time.